So good afternoon and welcome everybody to this online book discussion that we at the Department of Political Science, University of Hyderabad are organizing today. We are very happy to have with us Dr. Sushmita Pati, who's joining us from Bangalore. Dr. Aniket Alam will be the discussant. And thank you so much, Dr. Arvind Susarla, for agreeing to chair the proceedings. Before I hand over to him, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our panelists today. So Dr. Sushmita Pati is Assistant Professor of Political Science at the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore. She studied political science at Delhi University and Jawaharlal Nehru University. Before teaching at NLSIU, she has also taught at Azim Premji University, at St. Stephen's College and Ramjas College at Delhi University. Dr. Pati has also held a postdoctoral position at an Indo-German research collaboration called the Marian Tagore International Center for Advanced Studies, Metamorphosis of the Political, popularly known as ICA-SEMPI in Delhi. She is interested in studying the intersections of urban politics and political economy, and her writings have appeared in several journals and edited volumes, including Economic and Political Weekly, contributions to Indian sociology, and also popular media outlets like The Wire and the India Forum. Today, we are here to discuss her first book, her most recent book, let's put it like that, before the next one comes. It's called Properties of Rent, Community, Capital, and Politics in Globalizing Delhi. Which is published by Cambridge University Press. I'm also particularly delighted, and if I can add a personal note to this, Sushmita and I have studied together at Jawaharlal Nehru University. We've been friends for several years, and I'm extremely glad to be hosting this book talk, which is a result of her doctoral research. With us as discussant today is Dr. Aniket Alam. Thank you so much, Dr. Aniket, for joining us today. Dr. Aniket Alam is Associate Professor at the International Institute of Information Technology, popularly known as IIIT in Hyderabad. He's a historian who has also studied at Delhi University and Jawaharlal Nehru University. He's the author of Becoming India, Western Himalayas Under British Rule, published by Cambridge University Press. Dr. Aniket Alam has also worked as a journalist, editor, publisher, and international non-governmental organization employee. He has been for several years the executive editor of Economic and Political Weekly until 2016, and was also a journalist at The Hindu. He has also worked at the Swiss Agency for Development and Cooperation and the Panos International. His current work, very interesting work, focuses on the social history of a trans-Himalayan frontier, the Spiti region in Himachal Pradesh, and is also working on a history of the Asian highlands using very innovative methods, apart from archival and ethnographic, which include use of computational tools like spatial informatics, natural language processing, big data analytics, and social network analysis. Thank you so much, Dr. Aniket Alam, for joining us. Our chair today is Dr. Arvind Susarla. He's an associate professor, a colleague at the university, who teaches at the Center for Regional Studies at the School of Social Sciences in University of Hyderabad. Dr. Susarla obtained his doctorate from the Department of Geography at Clark University in USA, and his research interests and writings have been broadly in the area of disasters, including in urban settings. Thank you so much. And I now hand over the proceedings to Arvind.
Thank you, Sneha, and welcome to Sushmita, welcome to Kate. And I'm going to be brief, but before I hand it over for the next steps, what I want to say is the process is going to be a little ifs and buts, because everyone seems to have a connectivity issue. I myself have a connectivity issue as we were speaking. So bear with all of us and we'll work around that. Having said that, let me say I'm glad that I've been invited for this. Sushmita, I had a chance to read the book, and thanks to Sneha's good offices, we got the book ahead of time, so we got a chance to read it as well. I enjoyed it. Thank you very much for writing this book. And, the way I see it is the book is a story of a socio-spatial mosaic. It's a decision to at some point it has been taken to identify an area as a revenue, and the non-revenue area was made by the colonial government. And once this decision is made, it seems like planners or planning made attempts changing as the identity, but were unsuccessful. So did the political class. They too were unsuccessfully changing the identity. And as you would hear more, Sushmita says that there is a vernacular capitalism that has taken hold. So in other words, it's just that the space itself has taken a life of its own and continues to do so. That story is what she's going to be telling us. And it's a fascinating story that I had read through the pages of this book titled Properties of Rent. Welcome, and to all of you who are here. And Sushmita, if you can, it's a challenging task, but if you could put it in about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we would probably turn it over to Aniket, who probably will give his comments for about 15-20 minutes. Aniket, is that okay with you? And somewhere around that time. And before we open it up for
absolutely. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
So,
yes.
and after that, we'll open it up for everyone to join in and give their comments and questions and so on. If you can type in your questions in the in-call messages so that I could pull them and bring it to the attention of the Sushmita for her comments towards the end. So that's the format for this afternoon. Once again, thanks to Head of the Political Science and thanks to Sneha, and I'm glad to be here. And over to you, Sushmita.
Thank you so much, firstly, to the Political Science Department at University of Hyderabad. I've been to University of Hyderabad once, and it's a lovely, lovely place. And I'm so grateful to be invited here. And more so grateful to be invited back by friends who have been a part of this process of writing and researching this respective areas. They've seen these, Sneha especially has seen this piece shape up. Also, thank you, Professor Susarla, Professor Alam, and Professor Kamfort for having me here and sparing time to read and take the care to engage with this work. It means a lot for a first-time author who was just put in probably one of the biggest piece of work that I've so far done in my lifetime. So that really means a lot, and it's really special. So on that note, what I'll do is, sorry. Can you see my the screen? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Not yet.
Okay, I'll just try sharing it again. Wait. Is it visible?
No, not yet.
I'm not. I'll let me try.
Sneha, your share permissions enabled. Just check once.
Oh, okay.
Okay, never mind. I'll just start meanwhile. If that happens, it happens. So what I'm trying to do here is that I'm telling the story of particularly Delhi and how cities are made specifically by constantly swallowing up rural villages which are right outside it. In a way, the current crisis that's happening in Bangalore with Bangalore flooding And I think it's not happening. So anyways, I'll just go without it. And I hope, or what I'll do is maybe I'll try to share it to Sneha and see if maybe.
Yes, I can maybe project it. Yeah.
So if that happens, I'll just do that meanwhile. So those of you following what's happening in Bangalore, it's probably is a ramification of a similar story. It's shaped up differently in Bangalore, but it's a similar story of what happens when a city becomes technically it becomes real estate, right? So spaces which weren't governed by the logics of real estate, what happens when they suddenly come into the life of urban politics and urban real estate, and how they shape up, and what does real estate do to these erstwhile villages which were governed by wetlands, which had its own sense of ecology. It had its own sense of property and ownership. Just give me a second. I think, yeah, it had its own sense of property and ownership, which governed the city, which governed these spaces. But as much of what happens in urbanization is, wait, I think I'm sort of lost. Yeah, much of what happens in.
Sorry to interrupt you, Sushmita. Have you emailed it to me?
Yeah, I'm trying to attach it. So I'm trying to do all of this together, which is what is getting me.
Let's take a 1 minute pause, maybe.
Yeah. I'll just do that. Just sent. Yeah. Okay. So you probably get it. So what's happening in Bangalore is also a ramification of this similar kind of an urban-rural kind of a confrontation, which we're seeing in terms of an ecological crisis. And I think it's a lot being written about what's happened in Bangalore and how the real estate-ification has sort of changed the nature of the ecological pattern of the city itself, which is why it's leading to flooding. In Delhi, I'm looking at it differently. I am precisely looking at the same phenomenon. I'm looking at how these villages, which were not necessarily governed by the urban logics of space and value, suddenly gets to transform and suddenly changes into something else altogether. I'm not looking at the ecological side of it. I'm looking at what it does to the value of land itself. So how does an agrarian land, which is valued for its, say, whether it's fertile or not, whether it's close to a water body or not, it suddenly begins to get defined by whether a road's going next to it or not, whether there's a shopping mall or a big university just coming right next to it or not. So the logic through which this rural land is governed begins to change over a period of time. And that's the story that I tell from 1950s onwards. This is a time when Delhi probably, so those of you familiar with Delhi would know that Delhi, around 1950s, which is the time when it gets its independence, its precincts were closer to where much of what we today understand as central Delhi, right? So probably areas like Karol Bagh, Gol Park, these used to be the limits of New Delhi's precincts. So it's much of what we understand as south of Delhi, which is, many of you probably heard of Safdarjung, Hauz Khas, Mehrauli. All of these used to be villages which were around. Thank you, Sneha. So it's finally up. We can move on to the second slide. Yeah, so that's the cover of the book. So this is, I think we can stay here, right? So much of what were villages actually begin to get, so land acquisition takes place, and under that mode of land acquisition, what happens is that a lot of rural land, which is on the southern side of the city, gets incorporated into the city, right? And these were mostly Jat and Gujjar villages. Jat and Gujjar, and I'm speaking mostly of two Jat villages. Jats are an agrarian caste. which are also designated as a martial race by the British. So they've had their own trajectory, which I sort of discuss in the book. But by and large, if you look at this map, we'd probably, if you can read bits of it, you'll probably get a sense that these are, so you can see, if you can see Karol Bagh, India Gate, Connaught Place, and the Diplomatic Enclave, towards the south of it, where much of the city of Delhi has grown post-1950s, it's comprised mainly of villages. And this is precisely the villages that I am concerned with in the book. Right. So what I look at is this curious way in which land acquisition takes place, where land is, this policy of land acquisition takes only the agricultural land of these villages, but leaves the Abadi area, which is the residential area of these villages, intact. It doesn't necessarily take it away. And what it does, what happens as a result is that villages become cloistered around by the city. And as the city grows, these villages also begin to transform and to morph according to the needs of the city. So here what you see is, so these villages were administratively termed as urban villages, which meant that, which is an oxymoronic term, right? In so many ways, that it's an urban village, it's a village which is not entirely rural. It's a village which has now become urban. And that has its own implication on the story of what it means for the city. So what I'm doing is that many scholars, and plugging into the literature, where scholars have begun to complicate the story of urban and rural, so that the urban and rural are not necessarily a neat distinction. The rural and the urban are constantly intermeshed, especially if we look at suburbanization and how, say, newer parts of the city, I'm sure this is true about Hyderabad as well, the newer parts of the city are constantly encroaching into the village, right? But at the same time, the village does not quite disappear. The village continues to exist, maybe different in different cities, maybe different in different parts of the what space we are looking at, but they continue to exist. They continue to remain as an integral part of this new growing city. In my case, in the case of Delhi, we see it more in the way of urban villages, right? So in this talk, I take you through the conflict of being villages in a city that is growing fast, their lack of trust towards the outsiders, their tendency to stay close together in the face of the onslaught of the city. But I show that this conflict is also one of that between of capital and rent. One that it's crucial for us to understand if we are looking at urbanism today in the subcontinent. It ceases to be a question of simply urban villages or even Delhi. This conflict between rent and capital, I argue, shapes much of suburbanism in the global south. So in many ways, I'm arguing that this isn't an exceptional story. This is probably, we have, and much of, say, the literature on cities has been dominated by the lens of capital. We're always looking at how capital has transformed cities. We haven't quite understood what something like rent does to cities. And my book is, the only submission, the major submission that I'm making is precisely this, that I think we need to look beyond capital in order to see how rent shapes these cities, right? So what I'm looking at is how does rent define the cities in global south. So by this, what I'm looking at is I'm looking at two villages, which is Munirka and Shahpur Jat. Sneha, can we have the next slide, please? Yeah. So Munirka and Shahpur Jat. Munirka, those of you who are from JNU would recognize this place immediately. It's right outside Jawaharlal Nehru University's campus, and we used to be frequent in-goers and out-goers of this space. And the other is Shahpur Jat, which is around 5-7 kilometers away. And I'm tracing their respective journeys since 1950s. Munirka's land was acquired in the late 1950s to mid-60s. Its agricultural land was almost immediately put up for urban development. The ring road, RK Puram, JNU, constructed almost immediately in the 1960s. For Shahpur Jat, those lands were acquired in the 1960s.
Yeah, slides दिख रहे हैं ना तुम्हें?
Construction, construction only, if a Shahpur Jat begins to come up only around late 1970s for the Asiad Games village. So most of the people, even if the land is acquired in Shahpur Jat, people are still farming on that land until the late 1970s, right? As real estate prices begin to rise in the 1990s, their village land suddenly becomes sought after property. In this book, I show how these two villages develop somewhat differently owing to the time of the acquisition. Munirka comes in the throes of urban development almost immediately. It begins to, Shahpur Jat begins to develop as a residential space for migrant workers. Shahpur Jat somehow begins to get inhabited by migrant government workers by 1980s and soon develops into a garment manufacturing hub. In Munirka, by 1990s, because it gets urbanized rather fast, it's developed in 1960s itself, it's developed into a market. By 1990s, it's already become a very, very popular space for migrant workers to come and start living in, right? And there's a story to it, as in the story, the way in which I'm looking at it is that these villages, as I'm framing it in the book, they come up in the shadows of the master plan. Just because this master plan had no idea what to do with these villages, how to plan them or how to even make sense of them. They had very little clue about it. So they let them be. They didn't quite mess with the city as much, right? So mess with these villages as much. So these villages continue to be forgotten by the plan. Similarly, in these master plans, in the Delhi master plan as well, there are two other things which get forgotten. One is, of course, the space for the migrant workers, as to where will the migrant workers who come to the city to look for a living, where will they go? Where will their manufacturing units go? The manufacturing units are thrown outside the city, but Avadindra Sharan tells us the story as to why that is impractical, why it didn't. You couldn't have small manufacturing units that far from the city. And the third thing that gets forgotten are the migrant workers themselves, right? So in a way, these villages become those curious spaces where it begins to absorb all these elements which are forgotten. So starting from manufacturing units or even housing for the urban poor or the let's say, not necessarily urban poor, but even say the migrant workers, these spaces, these villages begin to become those spaces, right? So as a result, what I'm looking at is the way in which Munirka develops into a space which gives way to this working class, this precariat urban working class, which suddenly gets a certain kind of a fillip post 1990s, right? So this, as service industry grows, as you need to have more and more, let's say, white-collar jobs, right? Not necessarily laborers, not necessarily construction laborers or something. It creates a space for a particular kind of housing which isn't necessarily slums, right? So these are people who are starting off young, who aspire to have a middle-class life, but cannot necessarily afford one. So as a result, what happens is that a village like Munirka begins to cater to precisely this kind of housing market. These could be young students, this could be people who work in, in malls, in spas, who probably working as security guards, auto drivers. These are the people who begin to find housing in a village like Munirka. On the other hand, Shahpur Jat emerges as a manufacturing space. It is a place where garment manufacturing is quite dominant, and much of the economy is governed by the whole manufacturing business. So you have karigars who live in the village, who work in the village, and they run the economy of the place. So if you see, the map isn't the most clear. What I'm trying to show in this map is how post 2000s these spaces begin to become more and more urbanized, right? So you see that specific areas of the village begin to get more densely populated, more and more families, more and more villagers are breaking down their houses and constructing according to the rental need. They're constructing according to what's the market, what's the rental market looking like. So in Shahpur Jat, it gives rise to either manufacturing workshops, or it gives rise to a richer clientele of studios and fashion designers, hubs, and so on and so forth. In Munirka, it gives rise to one-room sets. These are just one-room apartment-like housing with very small, very compact, very poorly built, very badly ventilated, but will still give you a place to live for 7,000 rupees a month, 8,000 rupees a month, and that's about it, right? So that's what this market is about, right? Yeah. So I therefore foreground the phenomenon of rent in this discussion. I argue that this urban-rural conflict can be best understood through this conflict between rent and capital. Rent, unlike capital, is not produced by labor. Simply put, rent is an expression of possession. There has been a general consensus among classical political economists, Adam Smith, Ricardo, and Marx, that value is generated by labor, and therefore rent is not productive. As a result, rent has often not been given much attention. So you wouldn't find rent being discussed in much of like classical political economy literature, or has been looked at rather pejoratively, that rent seekers are bad, or that they are an impediment to capital. I enter this conversation through rent's place in urban political economy. Urban political economy too has for long been dominated by the analytical framework of capital. We barely know much about rent, but anybody who has ever written on rent would agree that rent is slippery as a concept. Rent is best understood as a product of an economy where capital is privately owned. But with financialization, it has become extremely hard to distinguish between value extraction and value production. Modern banking, Mariana Mazzucato argues, even though is now engaged in what would be understood as usurious in the 19th century, but is considered to be producing value. Right? Both rent and capital are extractive, they both work in conjunction with each other and create cities that thrive on their violence. But they are also deeply divergent in many ways. Capital and rent together, though through their flows and frictions, constitute spaces and sociabilities that together go on to make these city spaces. Clearly, an analysis purely built on capital only takes us so far. Rent, historically, has either been seen as an annoyance or a faithful ally in the process of accumulation of capital, which is why the question of value has continued to plague rent. While some scholars believe that rent does not generate any value and merely grabs it, some others argue that maybe a modern theory of rent can be seen as productive. But time and again, we see that the relation between value, rent, and finance is not necessarily very seamless. All the same, it continues to be at the heart of capitalist production. This relationship between capital and rent has been, as a result, quite tenuous. How is rent different from profit? Can rent carry value? How does rent transform from Marx's agrarian context to an urban context? Clearly, these intense debates are a result of rent's centrality in finance capital. In this book, I turn this logic on its head. I instead try to look at global capital from the vantage point of vernacular rent. If rent in this context is defined by possession, how then do these urban villages owned by landlords find their space in political economy of a global city that is defined by finance capital? And that's the story I'm telling in this book. And part of this broader continuous, and I'm saying that this is a part of a broader continuous Northwest India, which is Bhaichara. Can we change the slide? Yeah. So this is Shahpur Jat. This is an image of Shahpur Jat. You can see how these are the lanes of Shahpur Jat, and it's dominated by cafes, by fashion retail brands, even some curio shops, which actually cater to a very expensive South Delhi clientele. During wedding season, this place is extremely busy because everyone's wedding clothes are all probably being made in this place, right? Can we move on to the next one? Yeah, so this is one of the ways in which, so this is an older house, it's a haveli, which is being broken down during the time of the fieldwork. It's probably transformed by now. Which it gets reconstructed into, again, showrooms and manufacturing units and so on. Can we move to the next? Yeah, this is Munirka. You can see that this has a very different feel to it because the homes and the houses are really close to each other. The lanes, this picture has been taken, and you can see that there is broad daylight outside, but the lanes are so close to each other that you don't get any sunlight. So if you're walking, there are tube lights switched on all the time in these lanes because otherwise it's pitch dark, and that's how close they are. You can see the messy electric wiring and how unsafe these places can be. The construction, as you can see, is fairly poor, but this is a big place, and this frequent conversation around what happens. Delhi is prone to earthquakes, and this frequent conversation around what's the possibility of an earthquake in Delhi. And so these places have been at the heart of, not at the heart, but I would say that the concern of people living here is also, as in many people will tell you, okay, you know, what happens when that eventual fateful earthquake will come? How will people even run out of a place like this? So yeah, so those kinds of very structural, infrastructural issues remain. Can we move on to the next? Yeah, so this is a one-room set of. I'm not talking about Manoj here in this talk, but you can. It's a one-room family. It's a family of 3 people. Manoj is an auto driver I spoke to, and that's his house. You can see that that's his child's study table, and that's where the TV is put. And that's the balcony actually through the door that you can see. You can see clothes hung there, but you don't see any light because the next building's wall has closed in that much, right? So there is literally no scope for ventilation, natural air, natural light in these places. Yeah. Can we move on to the next? I just want to check this.
I don't know why it's not moving.
Yeah, give you a sense of these places and what these places look like, because not many of you have probably seen these places. So yeah, so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to tell you the story of Bhaichara, right? I'll come to what Bhaichara is and how that links to the question of rent. Bhaichara was technically a land tenure system that dominated the northwest part of India. But it is always more than a land tenure system. Bhaichara, that roughly translates into brotherhood, was also a way for the community. The community coalesced around the idiom of Bhaichara during colonial times. Each time they faced opposition from a harsh state or natural calamities. The most militant activism of Panchayats was seen in relation to taxes in the 16th century. So what I won't go into this, but these villages are a part of the broader continuum of Panchayats in all way up to Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. Of course, as in we know of a different story of Panchayats of honor killings and such. Those are not quite common here, but there's a way in which those territorial associations continue all the way up to Delhi as well, right? Yeah. So the solidarity remobilized itself into the language of modern politics through political parties like Bharatiya Kisan Union and Lok Dal, and organizations like the All India Jat Mahasabha. So those of you who are familiar with agrarian politics in the 1970s would know of figures like Chaudhry Charan Singh and Tau Devi Lal, and what they meant for even someone like Mahindra Singh Tikayat, and what they meant for this broader territorial coalition, political coalition. Since the 1960s, partly abetted by land acquisition, joint families were giving way to nuclear ones across rural Delhi. Though the older modes of association, like the joint family system, were feeling considerable strain, notions of community evolved very differently. As the city moved towards a liberalized economy, the relationship that the community had forged with the city and the state also had to reinvent itself. Rent now began to be reoriented to collectively manage private property. Right? So similarly, this is a collection of landlords who what they owned in the city was valuable land, right? And which has increasingly entered the game of real estate post 1990s. So as a result, the landlords quite quickly realize that this is where their strength lies, in the fact that they hold this valuable resource of land and property mostly together. With the boom of the 1990s, when almost anyone could become a landlord and earn money by renting property, it was only sensible to invest in the housing rental market, and that's how this market exploded post 1990s. I won't go into it. How much time do I have, Sneha?
I think you still have 10 more minutes, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, 10, 15
yeah,
minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So, yeah. So here I'll tell you the story of this very interesting figure, who's Chaudhry Mahendra Singh Tokas, who used to be the Panchayat leader of Munirka village. So in 1999, the newly formed Resident Welfare Association in Munirka, under the leadership of Chaudhry Mahendra Singh Tokas, brought out a village directory with prints of hand-drawn maps of various clusters of housing in the village intact in the name of mohallas. He also took the effort to number houses across the village so that there could be a standardized address that was not there before. A village directory was printed and circulated with freshly indexed house numbers and each with the names of the head of the family. But soon enough, those house numbers were rendered ineffective. The process of construction never really stopped. New houses kept cropping up, new property divisions started taking place, and the local geography remained fluid. Today, the panas or mohallas have merged seamlessly into each other. Other landmarks like chalks and wells have simply disappeared, and house numbers have no bearing on the location. However, people continue to use these invisible mohallas and chalks, although they have been rendered nondescript. Along with the village directory, Mahendra Tokas published a few such more booklets. One of them was a booklet of the social history of the village, complete with family trees defined by male lineage. Another booklet on the details of social customs and practices. Another booklet documented the... Sorry. Another booklet documented the Haryanvi idioms and phrases commonly used in the village of Delhi. In the maelstrom of development transformation, Tokas had felt the need to painstakingly archive names of forefathers and provide a detailed description of social customs or riti rivas, which is customs, around festivals and kin structures. When examined closely, it is clear that this is anything but a coincidence. The city by the 1990s had finally closed around the village. The old ways of living were changing rapidly. It only made sense to document in writing all the social practice that Tokas feared may get lost in time. In 1997, Mahendra Singh Tokas, the same guy I'm talking about, Pradhan of the Munirka Panchayat, took the initiative to register the RWA with himself as the new chairperson. Now, this is an interesting shift that I put a lot of care in the book in sort of delineating as to that this means something. Conflicts over land and property among villagers were on the rise, and not being a recognized body by the state was not helping, because panchayats were not quite acknowledged in the urban space, right? So panchayats could only exist in the rural space. So them not being recognized really hurt them, right? So the RWA, so that's the reason, that's the immediate reason why Mahendra Singh Tokas decides to register the panchayat as an RWA, right? The RWA was supposed to be a new institution, but it continued to be an extension of the panchayat. Informality allowed panchayats of these urban villages to transform and transmute in ways different from panchayats elsewhere. As an RWA, the organization became visible in the public sphere of the city, but at the same time, it continued its double life as an informal panchayat that allowed it to do just the opposite, to remain invisible from the eyes of the state. The panchayat is able to function and intervene in the social and political life of the village in ways that no modern political system would allow it to. Its existence as the panchayat, though quite different from its pre-colonial variant, allows its flexibility and informality that lets it intervene in the economic organization of the village and its real estate market. The panchayat registered itself as the RWA, but from the outset, it overstepped the usual scope of the functions of the RWA. The mandate of RWA is to facilitate civic amenities and organize social events within the communities. The village directory brought out by the RWA emphasized on the role of the village elders, the need of the community to come together to organize daughters' weddings, as well as to hold mediations for property feuds. These meetings could not be attended by those who were, could only be attended by those who were permanent male residents of the village. Women until recently were not allowed to vote in RWA elections. Now this is very unlike the regular colony RWA elections. Eventually, panchayats or RWAs in Munirka emerged as economic cartels or associations of landlords. Paul Sweezy tells us that cartels are the final stage of development of monopoly capital, which is possible only after a high degree of centralization. As the one-room sets began to proliferate through these villages as units for renting out, the property units also begin to lend themselves to a higher degree of standardization. The panchayats or RWA are in effect associations of individual actors who need a platform to create a monopoly to be able to control the market. The emergence of this kind of panchayat or RWA can be traced back to the competition that was unleashed by increasing land values, which had to be replaced by some sense of solidarity amongst villages. So here what you're saying is, what you're looking at is how people control a valuable resource. Now, I think the debate is quite settled on this, that rent comes in only when you're looking at a valuable resource that is in the hands of a control view. It could be a software, it could be oil, it could be also some kind of an antivirus, it could be anything, right? Any resource which is understood as valuable, which is strictly controlled, could be understood as a way of thinking about rent, which is why a lot of times finance capital is now being looked at through the lens of rent, because what else is finance capital doing but controlling a particular kind of resource? It could be cryptocurrency now, for all you know, but also holding on to it and increasing its value, right, in the market, right? Right. So I won't go into the stories of it, so I don't think we have the time. But essentially, what I'm getting at is the story of rent and its nature of control. Control is essential to a rent market, to a rent cartel, or in fact to any kind of cartel. But control manifests differently in the two villages that we're looking at. While Munirka works in a somewhat subliminal housing market, Shahpur Jat rests at the fag end of the global garment industry, trying hard to gentrify and appeal to a clientele composed of upper-class Delhi elite. The villages in Shahpur Jat are a different deal. The younger generation here attempts to break out of the image that their grandfathers are associated with. Once my grandfather had slapped a guy found kissing someone in the lane. Brajesh, one of the stakeholders in one of these properties in Shahpur Jat, laughs and tells me, indicating to me his dissociation from his grandfather, as if in a way to indicate that he wouldn't be the one to be slapping around people for kissing someone. The landlords of Shahpur Jat are overeager to please their tenants, but coming across as polished and well-mannered does not mean diluting the nature of control. Despite having tried, the entrepreneurs function out of Shahpur Jat have not been allowed to organize. So even when they're very, very pliable to the tenants, which you wouldn't find, say, landlords of Munirka doing that, right? you would see that when each time when these entrepreneurs or fashion designers of Shapurjat have tried to organize themselves, they have put their foot down and have not let them organize themselves, right? The nature of security has also changed the spatial contour of the village. The lane would earlier be a common place, and this is a lane in Shapurjat I'm talking about, which has been given out to really expensive commercial clientele. Probably the monthly rent probably for one unit would be close to 2 lakhs, right? Even more. The lane would earlier be a common space for the elderly member of the village to spend time and also to keep watch over their properties and to look out for trespassers and other unwanted characters. Now the lane is monitored by professional private guards. The social control that has loosened up towards the village's high-profile tenants have moved elsewhere. The Bengali Muslim karigars are all coming from Bengali, from the northern part of Calcutta and so on and so forth. The Bengali Muslim karigars who live and work in the depths of the village remain invisibilized in every sense of the term. Clanking away at the sewing machines or peering into the adda frames with their needles, their presence is mostly manifested in the presence of innumerable handwritten posters announcing the requirements of karigars in Bangla. The fact that they blend into the environment so unobtrusively strikes one as odd if one knows a little about the space of industrial labor in the city. Not too far away from Shapurjat, Okhla, an industrial area with its dirt and grime, smoke and noise, simmers with labor unrest and strikes. But the working class seems curiously docile in Shapurjat. The landlords not only make sure that the property is well maintained and looked after, but they also take care of municipal problems, local disturbances, and even labor unrest. So while they control the rental property, the one thing that they compete with other landlords over is how much control they can exert on the working, the labor class within Shapurjat, who are all working on in the manufacturing units. The landlords may not be slapping visitors anymore, but most of them also double up as male authority figures to ensure that the laborers are well behaved. The value of a good landlord often translates into values of property as well, right? So this good landlord person, and it's mostly word of mouth, often are able to carry a higher rental value than others. Yeah, so I won't go into too much of details, probably, as in many of this could come out in the question answers. What I'm trying to say is that this sense of control and belonging is able to do a different kind of an extraction, which isn't quite possible through capital. Capital believes in quick buying and selling. Capital believes in anonymizing ownership, right? If people in this room are familiar with how shares with share market, they would know that it's very quick buying and selling. But here, this kind of extraction is defined actually by very strict and let's say very controlled kind of ownerships, right? And that's the difference, and that's I'm saying that much of the suburbanization projects in across the cities are probably a reflection of rent and not necessarily capital, because what we're seeing is how the city is growing is precisely by individual and collective efforts of erstwhile agrarian people who are now building for rent, right? So the commercial tenants, yeah. So here I'll just conclude by talking about Harvey, bringing back Harvey in, because I am picking up a quibble with David Harvey. David Harvey writes that in an urbanized world, the distinction between capitalist and landlord has blurred. And with the blurring of the distinction between land and capital, in places like Munika and Shapurjat, which are constantly in a state of being constructed, broken down, and then reconstructed, buildings are often not produced for the long term, but probably as commodities that need to be consumed and then reconstructed to meet newer demands. Clearly, capital and rent have overlapping realities, but also that become difficult to segregate at times. But if we were to subsume our understanding of rent within that of capital, we would be unable to grasp the essential ways in which power works here. So I am making a case that rent and capital are different. They have not become the same. The reason this economy is so closely guarded by the locals is because of the power that extraction gives them as a community. That control the villagers know very well, will not be possible in the realm of finance capital. And that control is not negotiable for their own sense of community. So it's not necessarily simply an economic decision, it's also an emotional, it's also a social reason why they need to hold on to property in order to also feel their own sense of identity in the city. At the same time, rent shapes more than just the processes of accumulation. Rent shapes cities. It creates new subjectivities and hierarchies and mediates the way in which the villagers relate to the city as landlords to urban migrants and entrepreneurs. Rent shapes the physical space of these villages and appears to be the only common asset which unites them socially and economically. It makes them brothers in a city. It makes the community in these villages powerful and yet vulnerable to the changing demography of the city. And that is why it isn't just a Delhi story. Property, especially housing markets, are sellers' markets almost everywhere. Increasingly, suburbanization in the global south seems to be fueled by rent and not capital. And yet, capital is never quite far away. This world of rent is constantly jostling with the space of the world of the global capital that we are speaking of. It may be a subset of capitalism that we are looking at, but at the same time, it maintains a very specific kind of its own identity, which isn't quite the same as that of capital. So on that note, thank you very much. I hope I wasn't all over the place and you got some sense.
Thank you, Sushmita. That was wonderful. It's interesting that you took the example of Bangalore. Because you are located there in Bengaluru, you kind of spoke of the floods. I was wondering if you had also thought about the bringing down of the towers in Delhi. That too also was not too far off, and whether that would be something you could have it in the comment section later on. Can we now ask, can I request Aniket to give his comments on the book that he will have as a discussant? And Aniket, over to you.
Right. Thank you, Arvind, and thank you, Sushmita, for the book. And yeah, I actually managed to get the hard copy and spent some time reading through this. Made some notes. As you would have realized, I'm actually. Sneha somehow managed to convince me to be the discussant for this book, but this is we are at the limits of multidisciplinarity. I'm a historian of the Himalayas. I look at colonial Western Himalayas, mostly trying to now look at trade and travel across the highlands of Asia, Buddhism, and in some ways, I feel a little hesitant to engage too deeply with this book because I don't have that background in either political science or in studies of, or rather say, let's say, urban studies. But putting my hesitation on the table, maybe I could give you some sense of how a historian who's from a very different field would read this book, and some of the comments might actually, as Sneha has hoped, would lead to some productive conversation. As a discussant, I think it would be good for me also to give a broad outline of the book as I saw it. I have well, again, it's a very, very, it's a book which is rich with ethnographic fieldwork. It reminds me actually of Clifford Geertz and the whole concept of peak description. And it is really wonderful to see something of such anthropological thick description coming out from the discipline of political science. So that's there. I mean, it almost these villages, Munika and Shahpur, come alive in the way they are counted. Uh, individuals, their struggles, their various trajectories. Over time, I mean, some of those are drawn out from the 1960s onwards. Uh, I have managed to read properly, line by line, the first 5 chapters. Unfortunately, the last 2 chapters I couldn't, which actually promised to be very interesting because I think the 6th chapter is about how the Dalits come into their own in this village, which is a Jat village, and I think 6th is about how it pans out. All the politics that you talk about pans out finally in electoral politics. So I think that would be really interesting. But from what I have seen, I think let me start with the strong points of it, then let me get into ideas that triggered. And maybe I could end these 15-20 minutes by talking about some of the things I thought, I was critical about, or I was getting into some sort of a thing that, why did this happen, or why were certain things framed in a certain way. So let's talk about the strength of this book is that I think this is, in a sense, among those new crop of research that is emerging, which brings together, which truly breaks down disciplinary boundaries. It brings together political economy, political sociology, cultural politics. And these are things which were, my voice is breaking.
Yeah, Aniket, you're breaking a little bit. Sushmita,
Okay.
if you can mute yourself, Sushmita, perhaps that might help. Aniket, your voice is breaking a little bit, but maybe it'll help if Sushmita just mutes herself, and let's see.
Okay, maybe I should also put off my camera. Maybe that would help.
Maybe. Let's see.
Yeah. All right. So, the strength of this book is that it truly is multidisciplinary in the sense that what would earlier be called political economy would be called political sociology, cultural politics. It seamlessly moves across these and inhabits them, domesticates them, makes them work for it in very productive ways. And I think it brings through, I think, at the end of reading this book, at least by finishing chapter 5, there's still 2 chapters to read properly. I think what it brings through is the warped and weft, in a sense, of the structures of power and the agencies of resistance, which together form our cities today. So, in that sense, I think this is really a remarkable book, which adds a lot to the way we see the city, adds granularity to our understanding of how the city has come to be, and not just Delhi, but the post-colonial city in the global south overall. Some of the things which I think are really interesting and could actually be productive for even further work. They themselves are very well fleshed out, but I felt that there could be so much more said to them, perhaps independent books of their own for each of this. This whole concept of kabza, which starts off actually the introduction, but goes through chapters 2, 3, throughout. This idea of kabza and how this idea of kabza is used by the villagers to acquire land, possess land, the entire world between legality of possession and control and the illegal possessions and the efforts to make them legal through various forms, how this idea of kabza actually is in constant negotiations with state power, but also within the kumbas or the clans of the Jat dominant community there, with other players in the market, with other castes in that village, and how Kabza becomes so crucial for people to get a sense of property. And I think there could be actually much more there, because, Kabza, in a sense that it is now used, is very different from how it emerges in the colonial period. And in that sense, it has a very interesting genealogy with pre-market economies, given the fact that a lot of what we call Jats today, and that again is a strong point of the book, where it links up the present Jat communities to the entire becoming of the identity of the Jat over the late medieval and colonial periods, how this idea of the Jat, I mean, from pre-market economies, the Jats emerge during the colonial period into an economy where things are getting commodified, land is getting commodified, agriculture, other than agriculture, pastoral flocks, water, etc., etc., labor is getting commodified. And in that context, how Kabza has changed, and yet in the manner in which the community works, in the manner in which families work, in the manner in which the Kunbas work together, Kabza still retains a strong sense of what it meant to possess in common resources, whether it's land or other things, in pre-market economies. And I think that actually opens up a lot of doors to think of how people are working with modern legal regimes, to think about possession, ownership, legality, and the whole political economy that Sushmita has been talking about in the book and also in her presentation here. The second thing I wanted to flag, which I think is really fascinating and which comes out so well in the book, is that the dominant academic literature, the narrative, as you would say with a capital N, has been of villagers moving to the city. But here it's actually the city which comes into the village and takes over the village. And in a sense, there is, I mean, of course, we know that even the villagers moving to the city, there is very little choice in that, but still there is an element of choice to move, to which city to move in, where to move in, things of that sort. But here the villagers and the village itself as a corporate body, as a piece of territory, is taken over by the village, the city. The city enters the village, restructures it as territory, as social relations, as political economy. And in that sense, I think one could deploy the concept of overdetermination here to see how what happens to these urban villages in Delhi, but not just in Delhi, in other places, is in a sense overdetermined by the manner in which urbanization takes place, and the fact that this dominant narrative of the villagers moving to the city is actually taken, is flipped over, overturned, where the city now has taken over the village. This actually links to something else, which has been there in studies of cities, historically, towns, the emergence of towns. And historians look at cities as basically, and I'm sure this is true for modern urban studies too, with which I'm much less familiar, as concentrations of power, of money, of concentrations of culture in a largely rural hinterland. And thus the city, in a sense, becomes the magnet to bring in resources, to bring in surplus, the distinction that Sushmita draws between capital and rent, bring both of them into the city. But the story that Sushmita is recounting is interesting. The village here becomes the magnet. The village here becomes the space which is drawing the city with the promise of speculative wealth, with the promise of rent, with the promise of converting these resources into capital, into political power. And in that sense, again, the story which is predominant in academic literature is then flipped over in what Sushmita is telling us. The village has now, in a sense, become the magnet. Now, as I was reading this thing, I was thinking back to some work, peripheral work I have done looking at urbanization in the Western Himalayas, which is a predominantly non-urban area. And I was from there thinking that what exactly does it mean for a village to become a city? Or how exactly do you define a city? And a lot of this is interesting in Sushmita's own writing in this book, where you have legal wrangles, you have laws, you have the master plan, you have popular understandings, which are not just about politics, it's not just about territory, it is also about aesthetics. The word I used for a different context was mentality. What exactly is the city? Is its definition grounded in political economy? Is its definition grounded in a certain demographic politics of power and organization of populations, which give it a different morphology? Or is it actually a mentality? So even when cities shrink in power, in their economic importance, that idea of that city, the idea of the town still remains. And similarly, what exactly is a village? That even if it gets urbanized, even if it gets taken over by the city, is it an idea? Is it something which exceeds all the other definitions of political economy and that sociology provide? And I think these are questions which Sushmita's work opens up. And I would be really sort of happy to see, I mean, if you have some something to say to these comments, but hopefully some of these at least would get into future work of yours, because these are really tantalizing questions which came up to me while I was looking at this book. Finally, I would leave you with a few questions which, in a sense, I couldn't really find answers to in your book. First is, the sort of counter posing of rent and capital appeared to me to be, well, it seemed to me that perhaps you are using two different definitions of rent and capital, one from the Marxian tradition and other from the neoclassical tradition. So in a sense, for Marx, the example you gave right now in your presentation about shareholders. Now, the share market is clearly within Marxian economics. It is rentier capital. It is rentier income, but it is rentier capital. It, however, does not produce surplus value. Whereas what is seen as rent in neoclassical economics is often disguised surplus value. So, for example, the addas where people are producing things and clearly surplus value is being expropriated from those workers, even at a small level, and various other productive economic activities that are happening, which are described in such great granular detail, they're clearly producing surplus value. So is it really rent? Is it really surplus value? Are you really using these concepts in terms of the way Marxists do, or are you drawing on them in the terms that neoclassical economics does when it divides it between rent to land and profit to entrepreneurship, wages to labor, etc., etc. So that, I think, may require a little more closer look. It may require a sort of a much longer argument there. There are one or two other questions which came up. One was that why did you, for example, pick these two villages? What was the criteria? So there are tantalizing hints which are. Should I stop while she reconnects, Arvind, Sneha?
No, Aniket, finish up, and just because then she can take it up.
Okay, I'll take about 3-4 minutes more. So why these? Yeah, why these particular villages? Why not others? What was the criteria? Were these being used in a comparative lens? Because sometimes that does come across in the book, sometimes it doesn't. So that was something I think could perhaps be answered here today. And
one second, Aniket, Sushmita says that her laptop may die soon.
Yeah, that's what I was asking, whether I should just
I didn't see that message being there. So,
okay.
Sushmita, will you be able to stay with us?
She's back.
Yeah. Hi, I'm back. I've rejoined from my phone, so I hope this lasts for a bit.
Yeah.
Sorry, please, Aniket, go on. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, I was saying that why these villages were chosen, why not what was the criteria? Not why not other villages, of course. I mean, one can choose any villages, but was this the comparative frame that was being used? Because that often there are these tantalizing comparisons being made, often they are not. So what exactly was happening with the choice of these villages? Was it because they were Jat dominated? Would it have been more productive to take a village which was not Jat dominated, where the where all the things that you talk about were very differently structured? And when I'm talking of comparison, there is also this whole thing of comparison with urbanization in other countries. So what is, I mean, there is a huge amount of engagement with literature. In fact, one of the reasons I couldn't finish all of them was because it is really astounding the amount of theoretical and other engagement that you have done with existing literature. It's really, really phenomenal. But I felt that there was not enough engagement with, say, comparing with existing urbanization and similar things that are happening. So I would think that could have been far more productive in this sense. And the final point that I would end with is that you have this excellent quotation from Marshall Berman. Old modes of honor and dignity do not die. They get incorporated into the market, take on price tags, gain a new life as commodities. And I was a little disappointed, Sushmita, to say that, you're talking so much of rent, but the Jats as the dominant community with their masculinity, which you all talk about with such a granular detailing, you don't talk about how all of that gets commodified. You start with this, and I thought in this chapter there would be, or at least in the following chapter, there would be this thing about how does honor and dignity get commodified? What happens there? What is the rent they are drawing on that? And that, again, I think would be so productive, so interesting to take on, at least in the future, in further work if you are interested. And final quibble, this is a small thing. I thought that, the really interesting thing about Munika is the Tokus clan and their near complete dominance over swimming at national and international fora. I mean, I think I don't know, I have not been following sports for the last 10 years, but I think till then, I think with a rare exception here and there, every swimming medal was won by people from the Tokus clan of Munirka. Something about that, what did it do? I mean, apart from just mentioning it, what did this swimming do? How it helped this village link up with a whole network of, international social capital, cultural capital, financial capital, link up with the state, negotiate with the state, etc., etc. But all in all, it's a wonderful book, so richly detailed. Congratulations on that. And I hope to finish read the last 2 chapters, which I have missed out on reading. Thank you. And I hope I didn't take too much of your time.
Not at all, Aniket, and wonderful that you could give all these comments as well. Sneha, so is Sushmita online, but just that she can't be seen? Is that what it is? She can hear?
Yeah, she's here.
Okay.
We can see her also.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, great. For those who are still on the line, please send your comments on the messages, and we can then bring those questions as well to Sushmita's attention, and then get her, or even if you have a comment, please type in and then we'll bring it to Sushmita's attention. Sushmita, would you like to respond to what Aniket had suggested or given his comments? Shall we start with that?
Yeah,
Meanwhile,
I think we can do
others
that.
will chime in the messages.
And these are quite a few and very substantial questions that Aniket has brought to the forum.
Select 1 or 2, and then we can go from there.
Okay, thank you so much, Aniket. I think it's really overwhelming to see, as in, and I think I said this at the beginning also, to see senior scholars. Just give me a second. And people who you've read, people you've admired for so long, take this work seriously and spend so much time reading and engaging with it. And that I think in itself means a lot to someone who's just starting out. And thank you for those great comments. It allowed me to see my own work in a new light. I think just the way in which you summarize some of these arguments itself made me think about the book differently, and as to how probably it's communicating different things to different readers. And I think that precisely is so valuable. So absolutely, I think there is a lot more to be said about Kabza. Kabza doesn't even begin to, as in what I've done here, doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of the life that Kabza has as a terminology, as a phenomenon, can be used to grapple with urban politics and politics, especially around land. But I think the way in which I've used it is in a conjunction with a longer study on urban politics, which has begun to understand land as let's say itself, or property itself as fluid, property itself as unfixed. We tend to think of property as definite pieces of land, but recent scholarship has begun to challenge that. Probably property is far more, let's say, elusive. It's far more liquefied than what we. It's far more fictional than we tend to sometimes look at it, right? So that's that's the long kind of literature that this I've used it in terms of. And absolutely, you're quite right. And here, that's where I think you were expressing your the fact that you're a historian and therefore you're finding it hard to engage with. But this is precisely, I think, where my limitations begin as a political scientist, because there is only so much of pre-market economy and pre-market agrarian, or maybe even agrarian markets, that I understand that would be very useful to say understand how land markets were thought of in agrarian communities. So I think here, someone who's a historian and also interested in the afterlife of that kind of property making in terms of its urban life, I think there is a lot to be done. There's probably an entire PhD, an entire another book you write about that's waiting to be written. The city becoming a magnet, and how you probably saw it as a village becoming a magnet. That's precisely what it happens. Thank you so much for the articulation of the question in that way, because that's precisely what it happens. In the fact that these villages are not seen by the state, or are at least sort of ignored by the state, they become, that's where the value really lies. That's where the fact that they could become commercialized in the way they could quickly maneuver around and create rental properties just like that overnight, was possibly is the factor that they are so lucrative, right? And that's where the value comes from. So in a way, yes, the village is a magnet for migrants, students, for UPSC aspirants who come to the city for the first time, even northeastern migrants who are coming to the city for the first time. That's where that's where they land up. They land up in these urban villages. So that's really the bustling space. And absolutely, I think what you said about the city and the village becoming complicated, that's precisely my entry point. I think I think we have done a great disservice to academics, especially when we began to distinguish rural and urban studies. Like rural and agrarian studies became one discipline and urban studies became another. I think we somehow lost quite a bit as to what could happen in between these. And precisely the question that you asked as to what makes a city, what makes a village a village. Is it really about infrastructure? Is it about what kind of houses do you have? Is it about what kind of people there are? And nothing really seems to be giving like a really clean answer, right? And it's true, like there are cities in the middle of the village. There are villages in the middle of the city, right? And they don't have to be necessarily called urban village. They could be called entirely something else entirely, right? I really loved Satyendra Kumar's work in this respect. His book, it's in Hindi, so therefore probably it could be not accessible to many who don't read the language, but it's called Badalte Gaon Badalta Dehat, and he's looking at changing morphologies of rural sociability today in Uttar Pradesh. And it's a fascinating story because he's talking about motorbikes and smartphones and what it's doing to the rural urban youth, along with joblessness, of course. I think that's a very interesting way of thinking about aspirations and especially what you talked about, right? Mentality. That's precisely where, as in, what is rural and what's urban gets deeply complicated precisely because of the ways in which we have continued to quote unquote develop, right? Coming to your questions, I think these are fairly important and big questions. I don't know if I'll be able to answer all of them, but yeah, the big question that you pose, which is the difference that I'm making between rent and capital, is it really that different? Am I confusing two probably very different economic traditions? The way I'm seeing it as a lot of it, yes, I am using both in a way neoclassical as well as Marxian approaches, but I see that the complications that the Marxian tradition invokes continues to have a life in the neoclassical ways in which both the discussion around capital and rent have shaped up. So there is a lot of rent work now that's emerging, especially around rent. Now there is someone called Brett Christopher, who's recently written a book called, I'm forgetting the title of the book, but it's the argument is, and the book is entirely on rent and looking at rent UK from the rent's perspective. What the book tends to propose is that it's the financial market is the financial economy itself is rent all the way down, right? And my work, and I don't know where this work falls and whether I am myself. This theory is rent. This theory is Marxian or neoclassical. I'm not sure where this falls. I tried to do justice to what I saw and what I understood from the field, and that's where I thought, as in, if anything, I'm doing theory from the global south, and that's where I see my own location. I'm not sure in terms of whether, but my response to that would be that this isn't the story of how finance capital is becoming rent all the way down in, say, UK. I still see that there is a significant way in which, especially when it comes to land, especially when it comes to property, right? The behavior, the language, precisely the mentality, the stakes completely change. Whether it is for a Jat landlord, or even if it is for, say, upper caste Tamil Brahmins who own property in Bangalore. I think the behavior, I am looking at Jats, of course, but I'm saying that the behavior isn't very different when we're looking at other kinds of communities which hold property. And it's true about Global South, and probably mostly about the subcontinent, that property owners are from very specific caste groups and community groups, and they tend to hold property together, right? And I think that defines the way in which we think about property ownership or we look at property ownership. So it's not surprising anymore that and that's something I talk about in the book, is that the fact that non-vegetarians wouldn't find housing in, say, many parts of Bangalore, or the fact that single women don't find housing in parts of Bombay and probably most other city, and Muslims definitely they don't find housing anywhere in this country. So I think there is something to be said about how property is very closely guarded by caste, right? And I think we have, and yeah, I think there is a way in which the story of, or the way in which, whether we look at urban history or whether we look at urban studies on urbanism done before, we have constantly looked at class. We haven't really looked at how caste also defines urban spaces, right? So we've talked about urban poor, we've talked about laboring classes, but we've tend to sort of omit the caste question. And I think there is a way in which caste and rent they closely work together. And that's what I'm doing here. Why did I pick these villages? So one reason is, when I was looking at these, trying to figure out, okay, what villages would I look at? I thought I'd look at one manufacturing space and one space which is for housing, right? One space for rent. So that's the reason why I chose those two. If I had to redo this project, I would probably frame it as a regional question. I would not look at, so you're right, there are tantalizing hints all over about other villages, what's happening in the larger NCR region in these villages. And I wish I had, I didn't. So that's also, I think, something I realized once I was halfway down, that I stopped seeing Delhi as a series of neighborhoods that you're used to seeing it as. I started seeing Delhi as a continuum of villages. And I think the moment we begin to see Delhi, NCR, and even beyond, actually, even UP and Muzaffarnagar, and even, say, for example, parts of Haryana, the story of this of territorial nature in which these spaces are constructed comes out really clearly. So yeah, given another chance, I think I would redo the story from a regional perspective. I would try to tell the story of what's happening to this region when this region itself is becoming quite central in terms of real estate. Honor and respect. Yeah, thank you so much. Again, that's how masculinity, notions of honor, notions of respect, they become commoditized. that's something I try to do in the 5th chapter of the book, which specifically looks at violence against Northeast. And my sense is that on one hand, this whole discourse of honor and respect, and the fact that other people are coming and polluting their honor and respect, their daughters are now under threat because of the presence of the unruly, especially northeastern migrant. And I speak about that kind of violence that breaks out often in these villages. I'm saying that those are the ways in which the rent also becomes far more strong, because there is a sense of opposition. There is also a sense of that we can very well do away with the people who we think are polluting these places. So this sense of masculinity, this sense of the fact that we are letting you live here and you can be thrown out anytime you want, this in fact allows for greater extraction. This in fact allows for arbitrary rent increase randomly, right? Or say, for example, non-payment of the security deposit. In fact, higher electricity rates that are paid universally. So what I'm talking about is a racial surcharge that many Northeastern and African tenants have to pay, precisely because they are quote unquote suspicious, right? And I'm saying this is a performance of the sense of honor, right? And also the sense of, and how that honor is getting eroded. And that's how it becomes commodified, but also at the same time lamented, because it's not, I wouldn't say it's entirely instrumental. There is some sense of lament also there, which gets articulated, and I talk about it at greater length in the book. I think I'm running out of time here, and I think similarly it goes into the sports question as well. The older generation is constantly talking about how the younger generation is weak, precisely because of the coming of the rent. They no longer feel the need for actively participating in sports. They no longer feel the need because there is easy money of rent. So there is also the racially becoming weaker. There is also that sensibility that is that rent generates. So rent generates money, it generates extraction, but on the other hand, it also generates a racial anxiety that many of these landlords and their families sort of go through. So I'll stop here, but thank you very much for those questions. Those are great questions. I hope I was able to do some justice, but there are several which I will have to keep thinking about. Thank you.
Thanks, Sushmita. That was great. You could answer many of those questions. There is a comment about how the fruit sellers of both Munirka and another colony in Delhi are having a difficulty. It's about how they have to negotiate by the people of the state or the police and others to have a hassle-free space and so on. It's a call for improving their livelihood security, maybe the responsibility of the state towards the people. That's how it has been put. So this is a comment that has come in the messages so far.
Right.
If you can bear with me for a minute, Sushmita, I have a question, sort of. What I'm getting at is that conventionally land is assigned to the use that generates greatest profits. In other words, we can determine the sort of a hierarchy of land uses based on relative profits. Or put another way, the same situation can be viewed that the greater the profit the particular use will generate, the more that use can afford to pay for the land. So that's what you're calling it as the ceiling rent. The maximum amount that a given use can pay is called the ceiling rent. So pastoralism will be at one end, perhaps, in agricultural farming activities, if you take it as an example, and it goes up. The ceiling rent will be highest, perhaps, for the commerce or business. What I'm getting at is that the location theorists use this premise in combination with the concept of economic rent which will explain why land is or not is being used or is not in for production. So what are some of those competing uses of this land that have been thought of by these people other than, say, residential? Or what is it that, why is it that they would not necessarily think of other ways of using that land in order to, increase their, or the ceiling rent, if you will, is reached, or the maximizing of that profit could happen? Is that something also that you have encountered? Is that something that also got your attention as part of the work? That something came to my mind. In other words, that location part also perhaps comes into play along with the economic aspect, economic rent that usually is you talked about. You want to repeat my question, Sushmita?
No. I think I please. If I've gotten it wrong, then maybe please feel free to correct me. But so I think I get your question about ceiling rent and why this as to why they have. If I'm not mistaken, then why are they not gentrifying? Right? Why are they not going for other, say, not just residential, but other kinds of, say, possibilities of using the land for even, say, higher economic rent? Yeah. So here is my sense, which is, and I sort of hint it in the book as well, which is that I think what these villages broadly realize is that there is merit in trying to tap into the market or the real estate market that exists in the middle. So in a city like Delhi, there is of course high real estate, right? Which is, say, your Khan markets and your Gurgaons, which are pretty high end. And on the other hand, there are slums, right? Which are, say, a different kind of a real estate kind of a space, right? Which is also, again, I wouldn't say it's not real estate. It's a different kind of real estate altogether, right? But by and large, what they're looking at is sort of filling what's in the middle. And in Delhi, I think, or in most cities, I think affordable housing is a raging question. It's sometimes it's probably easier to find very expensive housing or even like really cheap housing. What most cities struggle with is actually dignified, affordable housing that most service working class is looking for. And I think what these villagers have ended up doing is finding that sweet spot, saying that this is a market which has a demand. And we are uniquely located where we can actually and we don't need to put in a lot of money. We don't need to invest a lot of money, because many villagers are not necessarily very well placed in order to invest. So there is also economic disparity here. Not all Jat villagers are necessarily rich. So they figured out that there is this sweet spot that they are able to make the most out of. What I'm saying is that if there are, but you're right that it's not just housing that they have given their way, that have found their way into these villages. There are villages which specialize in just hotels, like cheap short-term hotels. Villages next to AIMS, which is All India Medical Sciences, which is a hospital. Villages next to that, they specialize in long-term rents, like short-term, long-term rents. So people who come for treatment for 6 months, a year, they find places there. So there are those kinds of, but what's one thing that's very interesting to see is that most villages have coalesced around one kind of property, right? A place, for example, a place like Ghitorni, which is close to Gurgaon, specializes only in godowns. What they rent out is, so Amazon and the Flipkarts and all of them just hire out godowns from there. Right. So what you see is that they specialize in one kind of rental property, right? Irrespective of what that is. And for various reasons, it could be something which seems like a quick opportunity at one particular time. But the collective investment in one kind of property is important, because I think that is where they're able to have a kind of a control over the market which gives them a higher edge, which gives them an upper edge upper hand over the clientele that they're dealing with.
Wow.
So I think whether they see value in, of course, there is gentrification. I wouldn't say that that doesn't happen. There is gentrification, but they don't necessarily see merit in the gentrification. So in fact, my argument is against gentrification theory. Because gentrification would assume that all places will eventually become, twin towers or, basically expensive real estate. I'm saying no. I'm saying much of our cities will continue to look like these villages, and these spaces they will continue to exist in between these expensive skyscrapers and your IT parks and your tech cities and so on and so forth.
Right. Wow. Well, okay. Thanks. And I don't see any other major comments at this point. Probably people also have to chew a lot, read your book, and get a handle on it. From now that they have heard you, they all probably will engage with that. As a geographer, Sneha has a question, I guess. Go ahead, Sneha.
Okay, so, and this question does not relate to the substance of the argument that has been very well covered in the conversation so far and in Sushmita's own presentation. I would like to sort of relate this to what Aniket started off with, which is researchers who are now sort of finding a way to maneuver and negotiate around strict disciplinary boundaries. So if you could just, I know this is in its scope, it's a very broad thing to be talking about and perhaps can be part of a seminar where a lot of different people can come and discuss this. But how do you, as a political scientist, how have you sort of negotiated doing field work, which is traditionally not sort of has been a part of the repertoire of method that are go-to for us. So as more and more researchers straddle these sort of different methods from different, which has its roots in different disciplines, if you could just sort of, as a political scientist doing field work, if for the benefit of students or even us, to think about more deeply. Yeah.
So I think the fact that the methods does look like this stems from the fact that it stems from my own sort of love-hate relationship with my mother discipline, which is political science. I've always had a very uneasy relationship with my yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm saying that in a political science department. So yeah. So
and you're recorded also.
I'm recorded as well. So I have had like a sort of a love-hate relation. I love the discipline, but there are also like parts of it which leaves me like really, really frustrated. And that's where I think, and also as someone who studied in JNU, I think it is, university like JNU gives students a lot of liberty to take courses elsewhere. So I think I was doing courses in history a lot more than I was doing in political science. And I think that opened me to the nature of and what granularity can do to a piece of work, right? To a question, to a research question. I think that's, so I tried to so in a way this book is a product of that. I'm trying to address the big political science questions. I'm trying to answer the big political theory questions, but I'm also trying to do it in a way that does not necessarily make it abstract. So I'm calling it in the book, I think in the introduction, I'm calling it how does one do small research in the world of big political theory? How does one do without necessarily becoming a case study? Right? I think there is a way of dismissing actually, so like fairly grounded work, and this happens a lot in political economy, especially, right? Good grounded work gets dismissed as case study of Indonesia or of Delhi or whatever. I think there is something to be said about, okay, can we do theory by doing actually grounded kinds of ethnographies. So that was really my challenge, and I think that was my major methodological concern. I did not want to give up on the bigness of theory. I wanted to do political theory, but I also wanted to do it in a way that did not necessarily make it abstract. So that's and I think that is probably the way ahead, at least for me, to do theory from the global south, because I think there is that's what is at stake when we talk about how does one theorize from the global south. When it comes to doing fieldwork, I think I was inspired a lot by ethnographies. I think I read tons of ethnographies which inspired me to take the field question or the field also very differently, but again making it, never losing sight of the political economy question of how does one theorize from here. So that's I think the long and the short of it would be actually I think just reading a lot of historical work, a lot of ethnographic work gave me a different lens of doing field research. And some of it I talk about in the book as to how I navigated the field itself, which you will find like some similarities with how ethnographers do. But yeah, thanks.
Thank you. That was really useful. Yes.
Thank you. If you get a chance, please do read this book. There are not only just rich details of the site and the field work that has been done, so many metaphors that have been employed throughout the book in writing, so much of language that it's there. So one would also get a handle on some of those kind of things. Sneha, if it's okay with you as well, shall we close at this point? Once again, Sushmita, thank you very much for writing a wonderful book and sharing all your thoughts again today. Aniket, as usual, though you couldn't reach the last two chapters, but still your comments were incisive, they were precise, they were good. And they were something that I think probably Sushmita will have to think more as well. So they were thought-provoking as well. That was wonderful. And thank you very much for taking the time to give these comments on the book. Neha?
Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, good
Thank you.
able to manage this and organize it and bring us all together. Thank you for doing this task.
Thank you so much. On behalf of the Department of Political Science, I would like to thank everybody for
absolutely. And
joining.
Ed is already there, so maybe thank him also. For Sushmita,
absolutely.
There's also this geography metaphor for you. I thought the urban villages, what it comes through for me is urban villages are places and not merely locations. Probably that is something to be thought of and next time as you go along. Thank you all for joining.
Thank you so much.
And continue to join us for the next events as well. That's Sneha would send it off for all of us. Thank you all.
This was lovely. Thank you. Thank
Over to
you,
Sneha,
Professor Susarla and Professor Alam and Sneha, of course.
Thank you, Sushmita. Thank you, Aniket. Thank you, Arvind. And thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
Bye.
Bye. Wish you all a good evening.